of prominence in the canon. Hence, oh, I got it. I got to check this recording thing off first. Hence, when Kate Millett's brief remarks about the princess in her seminal feminist critique, Sexual Politics, dropped like a bombshell, Millett's caustic language turned literary criticism into political polemic. The poem, she says, attempted to beautify the traditional confinement of women at any cost. Beneath the canny prince's facade of moderation, he's really his father's boy, rendering biological differences into petty phrases which only disguise the old king's rigid categories. His bromide like to like, but like indifferent, not like to like, but like indifference, simply passes off traditional inequalities as interesting variety. Once Ida succumbs to marriage under the force of sickbed sympathy, the prince abandons the role of invalid, becoming the dominant partner in an unequal union. Millett's critique opened the floodgates for sustained analysis of Tennyson as a proponent of Victorian patriarchy. Feminist scholars crafted extensive, often unflattering critiques. Tennysonians quickly joined the debate. Catherine Stevenson's Tennyson on Women's Rights, Marion Shaw's Alfred Lord Tennyson, and Donald Hall's The Anti-Feminist Ideology of Tennyson's The Princess are but a few examples of the many studies that point out or defend or attack Tennyson's position as a champion of male dominance. More recently, though, third wave feminists have pointed out that Millett tended to ignore or dismiss precursors in the movement. So I wondered, did earlier feminists share similar reservations about Tennyson's poetry? If so, what did they say? If not, why not? I'm certainly not the first to address these issues. Let me say at the outset that this is a preliminary survey based on published sources, many obscure and not listed in bibliographies of Tennyson criticism, but made accessible recently by databases such as HathiTrust. Further research might lead me to change my tentative conclusions. But let me begin. I want to first acknowledge that in her 2018 article, The Princess and the Generosity of Tennyson's Imagination, Linda Hughes writes that though it was by no means universal, 19th century feminist women writers found much to admire in Tennyson. Hughes cites several numerous examples of the impact Tennyson's poem had on their work. I hope to supplement Hughes's observations and further substantiate her claim that The Princess and other poems by Tennyson were admired by women now considered forebears of modern feminism. While few accepted without question Tennyson's views concerning the appropriate relationships between the sexes, many found his work inspirational for their own projects to rectify the imbalance they saw in Victorian society, where women's talents were being wasted because of wrong-headed notions about their capabilities. My survey covers the period from 1832 to the years immediately following the First World War. That is, from Tennyson's ascendancy as the coming man among Victorian poets, through his career as poet laureate, and the years when he fell out of favor with the reading public and especially with the moderns. I've divided my work into 5 categories. 1, Tennyson's influence on women writers. 2, the private or published comments that women have made about Tennyson. The uses of Tennyson's poetry, instances where it was employed to support or attack a feminist cause. Women's published commentary on Tennyson. And finally, his influence on one of the most celebrated feminists, Virginia Woolf. By the way, one of the precursors that Millett chooses largely to ignore. While second-wave feminists like Millett have disparaged the ideology of the princess, early proponents of women's education seem to have read the poem quite differently, perhaps more selectively. Most famously, it served in part as inspiration for the founding of Girton College, first women's college at Cambridge. Three-way correspondence among Bessie Rayner Parkes, Anna Mary Howitt, and Barbara Lee Smith, later Bottichon, references the princess as the spark that lit the flame for their educational reform. Bottichon's biographer, Hester Burton, quotes that as Bottichon and Emily Davis prepared to open Girton, they spent their leisure hours discussing the princess. One wishes one could have been a fly on the wall to learn what these important Victorian feminists really thought of the poem. Burton believes they found the princess as much a hindrance as a help, because the vision of Ida's university is presented in a comic poem that highlights the impracticality of the endeavor. Nevertheless, as Barbara Kane points out in Victorian Feminists, Davies' use of Tennyson's ideas despite her reservations about his conclusions, proves that it was not necessary for books to be explicitly feminist in their orientation in order for them to be either influential or helpful in formulating feminist ideas. While Davies makes no direct mention of the princess in her book, The Higher Education of Women, published just 3 years before Girton opened, she does call Tennyson's portrait of the perfect wife in Isabel insufficient to satisfy modern women who are being denied opportunities for intellectual advancement. She also quotes in memoriam, "For ground in yonder social mill we rub each other's ankles down." But she uses it not as Tennyson does to celebrate differences between urban and rural life, but to illustrate that the only way to maintain healthy diversity of opinion in a civilization tending to a uniformity is to provide women an education similar to men so that diverse opinions might carry weight. 50 years after the opening of Queen's College, alumna Ethel Tweedy recalls Tennyson as one of the group of remarkable men associated with Frederick Denison Morris in founding the institution. She may overestimate Tennyson's influence, but she believes the founders thought that at Queen's, quote, some of the aspirations of Princess Ida could be realized. Tweedy remembers Morris alluding to the princess in his address opening the institution in 1848. Ironically, though, as Sheila Fletcher has argued recently, Morris took some pains to disassociate Queen's from the splendid but transitory foundation established by the heroine of Tennyson's The Princess. No high-flown arguments about the rights of women assailed his audience, who learned instead about the misery of destitute governesses. Tennyson's poetry had a strong influence on numerous women writers, many of whom incorporated his work into their own or used it as a springboard to their creative endeavors. 2 decades ago, John Chappell reminded us of Tennyson's influence on Elizabeth Gaskell. Tennyson was also a favorite of Mary Elizabeth Braddon, presented in a positive light in several of her novels. Linda Hughes explained how Amy Levy appropriated characters from The Princess in a series of short stories about university women, and how African-American feminists Anna Julie Cooper and Pauline Hopkins incorporated sections of the poem into their novels, though, as Hughes notes, often for purposes of irony. Anne Howie has argued that in the American writer Elizabeth Stuart Phelps's 1871 short story, The Lady of Shalott, poverty-stricken protagonist stands in sharp contrast with Tennyson's noble recluse, highlighting the plight of working-class women whose stories are omitted in medieval romance. Where Tennyson's poem, quote, implicitly privileges upper over lower classes and medieval over modern as worthy subjects of poetry, Phelps, quote, inverts these poles of privilege, implicitly arguing that socially responsible art tells stories about the people for the people. Somewhat later, Sarah Grand borrows outlines of The Lady of Shalott in the Beth book, where, as Lynn Pikett observes, the heroine's secret room is a garret in which Beth attempts to make a life as an independent woman, forming her self-sacrificial, self-immolating act by nursing her Lancelot, the artist Brock, whom she first sees from her garret window, from the brink of death at the cost of her own health. Excellent Tennyson talks by Anna Barton on Mary Elizabeth Coleridge and Linda Hughes on the two women who wrote collaboratively as Michael Field highlighted the influence Tennyson had on younger women poets. Bradley and Cooper's biographer, Mary Sturgeon, reports that the two display their independent judgment, however, by bucking conventional wisdom in ranking Browning over Tennyson. Still more convincing proof of their independence, Sturgeon writes, is that in the age of Tennyson, they found his laureate suavity too smooth and his condescension an insult. Less independent in her judgment, perhaps, the musician Edith Linwood West found in Tennyson's Dream of Fair Women inspiration for her 1891 dramatic adaptation of Vision of Fair Women. Tennyson was acquainted with several women who've come to be associated with the Victorian feminist movement and seems to have been admired by many of them. Among those were Geraldine Dewsbury and Diana Mulock Craik, whose opinions appear to have been consistently high regarding his portraits of women and gender relations. Mary Russell Mitford, a writer from whom Tennyson himself borrowed, acknowledged that she preferred Tennyson among contemporary poets, claiming he had a power over my imagination which I could not have believed possible. Feminist activist Elizabeth Elmy deeply admired Tennyson's work and punctuated her letters with lines from his poems. If one can believe the historian W.E. Leckey, poet Anna Swanwick had a lifelong veneration of Tennyson, apparently finding his treatment of women no impediment to her considering him a kind of musical accompaniment to her life. Dorothea Beale, foundress of St. Hilda's College, Oxford, and longtime principal of Cheltenham College, considered Tennyson a visionary. But Harriet Martineau, who admired In Memoriam, admitted to F.J. Furnival that I cannot honestly say I had anything like so much pleasure from the princess. Unfortunately, she gives no further explanation for her displeasure. According to Gil Gregory, Adelaide Proctor, co-founder of the English Women's Journal, considered the Idylls one of the texts about women that she and her female contemporaries had to confront in their struggle for women's rights. Linda Hughes reports in her biography of Rosamund Marriott Watson, who wrote under the pen name Graham Orr, that shortly after Tennyson's death, Watson wrote a piece for Sylvia's Journal claiming he was, quote, never a profound thinker. He was a man of his time, never a man in advance in his time. One might ask, of course, what the big three, Charlotte Bronte, George Eliot, and Elizabeth Barrett Browning, thought of Tennyson's depiction of women. Bronte is said to have disliked his work. At least that's what Elizabeth Gaskell reported, and the notion has been perpetuated for over a century. Charlotte admitted that she couldn't finish In Memoriam, finding it beautiful but monotonous in its excessive expression of grief. One might have thought she'd have been critical of the princess, but we know that when she visited London to make the big reveal about the identities of the Bell brothers, she took time to purchase a copy of the poem for Emily. Furthermore, Alison Hodnott has argued persuasively that the portrait of Shirley Keeldar in Shirley owes much to Tennyson's Ida, though Bronte gives Shirley much more will to resist convention than Tennyson accords his supposedly independent-minded princess. We know Marian Evans and George Henry Lewis were friends of the Tennysons, and there's evidence in George Eliot's writings that she admired Tennyson's poetic abilities. That, however, did not stop her from writing a harsh review of Maud, excepting a few passages she writes, we wish to forget it as we would wish to forget a bad opera. But she makes scarce mention of Tennyson's eponymous heroine, instead protesting his mean-spirited diatribe against peace, industrialism, and money-making. Like Bronte, she had reservations about In Memoriam, claiming it has great beauties, though the artificiality of the form is unforgivable. Yet she admired it enough to copy segments into her journal after Lewis's death. She admitted to John Walter Cross that she didn't share the public's high opinion of the Idylls. Additionally, writing about her experience attending one of Tennyson's readings, she remarked, I saw an expression in his face that has always reminded me of a large dog laying down its ears and wagging its tail and being stroked and patted. So much for humor. Much has been made of Elizabeth Barrett Browning's dismissal of the princess. Even before it was published, she wrote to Robert Browning that from what she'd heard, the project didn't seem promising. Now, isn't the world too old and fond of steam? The blank verse poems and ever so many books to be written about the fairies. The letter to Mary Russell Mitford reveals her disappointment. What woman will tell the great poet that Mary Wollstonecraft herself never dreamt of setting up collegiate states, proctordoms, and the rest? Barrett apparently shared Wollstonecraft's view on university education, which she describes as a worn-out plaything in the hands of one sex already that need not be transferred in order to be proved ridiculous. Because Barrett Browning's remarks on the princess have become widely disseminated, it might be helpful to balance them with others she made about Tennyson's work. Writing to Mitford in 1844 about various French poets, she concludes, they have not in France such a genius in the way of genus poet as Alfred Tennyson, so we may stay at home and look at him. Complaining about John Edmund Reed's dismissive reviews of several modern poets, she wrote, if Tennyson is a porcelain poet, I should certainly be contented to pass for plain crockery. One would think also that if Barrett Browning had serious reservations about Tennyson's portrayal of women, feminist critics would have made much more of her criticism. But neither Marjorie Stone, writing her about Browning in the Women Writers series, nor Dorothy Merman, one of the first feminists to write a book about her, singles out Tennyson as an object of her opprobrium. Like Shakespeare's Macduff from his mother's wound untimely ripped, lines from Tennyson were used regularly to support or denounce the New Woman movement and women's rights in general. A brief survey of published materials indicates the extent to which Tennyson's work was mined for sentiments that supported a particular writer's viewpoint. One of the earliest uses of Tennyson's poetry by a feminist writer appears in Anna Jameson's Characteristics of Women, an analysis of Shakespeare's female characters published in 1832. In the introduction, constructed as a dialogue, a woman named Alda complains that, quote, the condition of women in society at present is false in itself and injurious to them. She explains that Shakespeare's women are not mere poetical abstractions, but are common clay hanging from the common earth, molded by God and tempered by the tears of angels to the perfect form of woman. The man in this dialogue, Medon, responds, beautiful lines. Where are they? I quote from memory, Alda replies disingenuously, and I'm afraid inaccurately, from a poem of Alfred Tennyson's. Indeed, the quote is inaccurate, but hardly due to faulty memory. The original from the prefatory poem to the Palace of Art, published only 2 years before Jameson's study, reads, tempered by the tears of angels to the perfect form of man. Judith Johnston claims that Jameson subverts the line both in altering the gender and in drawing attention to her alteration by the imposed punctuation, the dash, and italicizing the word woman. This misquotation from Tennyson places Jameson at the very hub of modern intellectual life in England at the time, confidently making use of her knowledge to empower her writing in a very specific way, to highlight the attributes of women and make them worthy of consideration. Linda Hughes has noted that the American suffragist Elizabeth Cady Stanton inserted lines from The Princess in an 1848 address to support her claims for women's intellectual prowess, finding Tennyson a kindred spirit. In succeeding decades, dozens of suffragists and their supporters quoted from the poem to lend sweet music to the hard logic of their cause. In almost all instances, advocates for women's rights adopted the line, the woman's cause is man, to support calls for equality. Among sources I've identified are remarks by another early giant in the movement, Carolyn Severance, who quoted The Princess in her address to the women's rights meeting in Boston. Let me repeat to you, she said in conclusion, exquisite stanzas of Tennyson so often read and heard, but never too often recalled, after which she quotes 20 lines. No statement, she continued, could better define the movement of ours. Clara Nyman, the leader of the suffragist cause in New York, concluded her talk at the 15th Annual Washington Convention of Suffragists with 9 lines from The Princess that celebrate, quote, a new type of manhood she believes is being reared in America, a type which Tennyson describes in The Princess. Man shall be more of woman, she of man. Speaking specifically of women's education at the 8th Biennial Convention of the General Federation of Women's Clubs, Mrs. B.S. Thayer argued that, quote, Tennyson spoke truly when he wrote, the woman's cause is man. In The Diaries of Women, a lecture series published in 1881, the crusader Frances Power Cobbe quotes from The Princess to make a point about the importance of women's emancipation. Men can be truly civilized and Christianized only when women are free and ennobled, and women can be truly emancipated only when men are moralized and purified. The two rise and fall together, as our poet-philosopher Tennyson says so truly. The Australian feminist Louisa Lawson, founder of the nation's first periodical for women, The Dawn, opens her first number with the observation that, quote, woman is not uncompleted man, but diverse, says Tennyson. And being diverse, why should she not have her journal in which her divergent hopes, aims, and opinions may have representation? Writing in the introduction to her 1891 edition of Wollstonecraft's Vindication of the Rights of Women about the inadequacies of the sexual transgression of men and the way the transgressions have been viewed, Millicent Garrett Fawcett insists that in this matter, as in nearly every other respect, men and women rise or sink together. Ella Napier Lefroy borrowed from Tennyson the by then cliche phrase, the woman's cause, as the title for her novel, exposing the dual standard of morality applied to men and women in late-century British society. Sheila Robotham reports that British feminist Hannah Mitchell effectively used the line, "the woman's cause is man," to rebuke a callow Methodist preacher who was quoting numerous literary sources to support his claim for the rightful subjugation of women. Closer to Millet's viewpoint, Eleanor Aveling wrote in The Woman Question from a socialist point of view that when true equality of the sexes is achieved, the portrait of the young woman in memoriam, that objectionable product of capitalism who spouts the line, "I cannot understand, I love," will be a myth. For Aveling, the daughter of Karl Marx, the portrait of the devoted wife whose life is subordinated to her husband illustrates what's wrong with the status quo in Victorian England. Aveling also compares Tennyson unfavorably with Shelley in lectures she prepared with her husband, Edward. Shelley's kindred fiery outbursts of practical teaching in the Revolt of Islam on the need for equality of the sexes makes a stark contrast to the uncertain sound and bated breath of the washed-out, emasculated, effeminate Shelley that is Tennyson. The breath is bated because it is that of a respectable gentleman, and the sound is uncertain because Tennyson does not grasp the real meaning of the relative positions of man and woman in today's society. Beatrice Webb also considered Tennyson's sentimental imageries as incomparable nonsense. She objected to his failure to deal with politics in his poetry as well. In something of a curious bit of irony, 1899, Annabella Dennehy cited the passage, "The woman causes man," only to denounce it as false. In her opinion, woman, too long the bondslave of man, can be liberated only when masculine licentiousness, tyranny, and selfishness are crushed. Curiously, though, the women's rights advocate Annie Besant seems to have found no contradiction between her feminist ideology and Tennyson's portrayal of women in the Idylls, as she chose to recite Arthur's farewell to Guinevere at a gathering of working girls in East London. Making greater use of the phrase "the woman's cause" and quoting considerably more lines from the princess, Francis Cellini writes in The Awakening of Woman's Part in Evolution that if Tennyson says woman is not undeveloped man, but on the contrary, a being diverse, distinct, and individual, we may be sure that in studying the woman's place in evolution, we shall find her plane of development cast on different lines. As an aside, Sweeney observes wryly that the human embryo, first being hermaphrodite, tends to maleness or femaleness according to conditions of food. Strictly speaking, man is undeveloped woman. In 1905, American novelist Julia Magruder employed Tennyson's Idylls to argue for change in current divorce laws, which bordered on cruelty toward both partners in an unsatisfactory marriage. While Tennyson presents Lancelot and Guinevere's illicit love with great sympathy and poignancy, Magruder admits, he sides with Arthur in blaming the kingdom's downfall on the queen's failure to live up to her marriage vows. The message of the poem is that in marriage, the letter is everything, the spirit nothing. The form is the essential part, and the sentiment the non-essential. Such may have been appropriate in medieval times, Magruder says, but not today. Idylls make clear the wrong-headedness of clinging to such outmoded beliefs. Like Aveling and Webb, English-born American expatriate Beatrice Forbes Robertson Hale writes harshly about Tennyson in her 1914 study, What Women Want, an interpretation of the feminist movement. It is singular that the people's poet Tennyson had little more to give women than had the people's novelist Dickens. The princess is certainly an advance on Mrs. Jellyby, but she is, after all, only strong when there is no prince to make her weak. She is at best only a beautiful hostess. And also in 1914, Francis Richard, railing against the strictly masculine standard of human worth, identifies Tennyson as one of those unfortunate writers whose words have been adopted by the patriarch to justify the continued subjugation of women. Even the mild and lovely Tennyson played into the hands of the enemy, she writes in some anti-feminist vagaries, as when he thought it desirable that woman should grow more and more fit to be man's helpmeet, till at last she set herself to man like perfect music unto noble words. Why the poet did not suggest that man set himself to woman, we can only conjecture. At the same time, Quotes from Tennyson serve to support more conventional views of women's roles. Frances Parthenope, Lady Verney, the sister of Florence Nightingale, in her essay The Powers of Women and How to Use Them, cites lines from the Holy Grail to urge better treatment of women so they might become equal helpmates in striving to make a better future for all people. The women's cause as man also inspired the flamboyant American political activist Tennessee Claflin, who married an English baronet and published a collection of essays under her new title, Lady Cook. She considered Tennyson's poetry visionary, projecting an age when every mother shall be reverenced as the race preserver and the life of every little one be guarded as a jewel of great price. In A Neglected Path to Greatness, an essay in the 1890 Westminster Review, Frances Russell quotes the happy he with such a mother passage from the princess to bolster her argument celebrating motherhood as women's highest calling. One might wonder what the 20th century philosopher Bertrand Russell thought of his grandmother's views. Similar sentiments, however, can be found in Margaret Sangster's 1905 Radiant Motherhood, a book for the 20th century mother. As late as 1917, Princess was being touted as a source of inspiration for upholding traditional roles for men, women, and, skip a slide, no. For men, women, and marriage. For example, in the laws of health and prosperity and how to apply them, Clara McLean opens her chapter Love, Marriage, and Divorce with a quote of more than 70 lines from the poem, claiming it is a portrait of ideal partnership that sanctifies woman's highest role as helpmate and mother. What these detached quotations often fail to do, however, is acknowledge the context in which these lines appear. Those who extract short quotes or often attribute to Tennyson himself ideas or political viewpoints that may or may not be his. During the 19th and 20th century, women published considerable commentary on Tennyson. These writers sometimes applaud, sometimes take issue with Tennyson's portrait of women, both directly and indirectly. For example, in a lengthy critique of his 1842 volume, Fanny Kimball Butler offers high praise. Among his poems are a collection of female portraits of extreme loveliness, grace, and purity that should make all women Tennyson's friends for the explicit perception he has shown of women's particular excellences. Publication of The Princess generated criticism more directly focused on Tennyson's portraits of women. In an 1848 review in the Quarterly, a journal with a history of being unkind to Tennyson, Sarah Coleridge, daughter of the poet, calls Princess Ida not very interesting to the heart, too soft to be terrible, and much too hard to be lovable. She praises Tennyson, however, for recognizing the plain truth of women's complementary natures, claiming they have been treated as subordinate creatures because men have not clearly distinguished between that part of our complex being which is conformed to a merely earthly existence and that higher portion, the reasonable and moral mind, which is to fit us for a state where there is neither marrying nor giving in marriage, that heaven of the soul in which men and women are on an equality. Addressing more directly the new women's cause, Anne Stevens wrote in 1848 that Tennyson's evident purpose is to repudiate, as far as he can by his genius, the modern idea that the sphere of woman is inferior to that of man, or that she ever does good by stepping out of it. Less than a decade later, however, critiquing the Southern Literary Messenger, a female critic identifying herself simply as Cecilia, adopted the opposite stance. In these days, there's so much fanaticism in regard to women's rights. We read with political pleasure any writer who gives the true idea of woman's duty and mission. And in the closed pages of The Princess, we have a just and beautiful exposition of her nature and her relations to man. Tennyson's subtle grace of expression and the music of his rhythm simply couldn't reconcile Cecilia to the essentially unlovely position of his heroine. Fortunately, Cecilia concludes, errors of Ida are more than compensated by her graceful recovery from them. Praising Isabel as a description of the perfect wife, Cecilia hopes for the happy day when women shall be satisfied with the sphere in which God has placed them. Tennyson's work was reviewed frequently by women familiar to most of us. Anne Moseley, writing in the 1859 on the 1859 Idylls in Bentleys, praises Enid's constancy in subordinating herself to her husband's wishes while being highly critical of Geraint's womanly tendencies, and castigates Vivian as the wily woman who overpowers the vulnerable Merlin. But Moseley does offer a feminist critique of medieval society, ironically excusing women of the Middle Ages for being swept off their feet by a figure like Lancelot. As we realize the vacant, hideous hours that ladies must have spent in these remote abodes without books, without letters, without roads, without society, we cannot wonder that a fine gentleman fresh from the world should make such a perilous impression. Elizabeth Julia Hassel, a frequent contributor to Blackwood's, published full reviews of Tennyson's work on the 1859 Idylls, on the Enoch Arden volume, and on the plays Queen Mary and Becket. As the editors of literary and cultural criticism of the 19th century observed, the little Hassel says about the women in the Idylls appears conventional. Vivian is a travesty of womanhood, Elaine pure but too naive, Guinevere morally culpable for the fall of the kingdom. Hassel's observations on the women in the 1864 volume fall in the same category. She has good things to say about Tennyson's characterization of the vilified Mary Tudor, judging his portrait psychologically convincing. That's my estimate, not hers. The best evidence of Hassel's view on Tennyson's women, however, can be found in her assessment of Rosamund Clifford and Queen Eleanor in Becket. There one discerns Hassel's dissatisfaction with Tennyson's habit of stereotyping women along conventional patriarchal lines, as saints in the case of Rosamund, or sinners in the portrait of the conniving and vengeful queen. Margaret Oliphant, whose feminist credentials have been challenged by some and defended vigorously by others, wrote several reviews of Tennyson's poetry and a lengthy obituary tribute. While she frequently faults Tennyson for failing to live up to his potential, she considered his poetry the highest expression of his age. Her comments on Tennyson's treatment of women seem fairly conventional. She admires Guinevere for the strength she shows, even as her disloyalty brings down Arthur's kingdom, but she finds Lynette an extremely impertinent and modern young woman who could only have existed in the 19th century. Oliphant believed Tennyson had no skill like Shakespeare to create women wonderful in their womanhood. Other writers, perhaps less familiar to us, have also commented on Tennyson's portrait of and views on women. One of the most intriguing critiques is an article called Woman's Vocation as Illustrated by Two Poems, published in the 1885 issue of Eastward Hoe. In it, the author contrasts the princess with Barrett Browning's Aurora Leigh. Maddeningly, I've not been able to identify the author. The article is not listed in any bibliography of Tennyson or Barrett Browning that I've been able to examine. Short-lived journal, it only ran 3 years, is not indexed in the Wellesley Index. Eastward Hoe published signed and unsigned articles by men and women. This one, alas, is unsigned. But its arguments are exceptionally germane to a study of opinions expressed by Tennyson's contemporaries about women's rights. The writer argues that a careful comparison of the poems exposes much about the place of women in modern society. Though often dismissed as light satire, the princess revealed that Tennyson's ideas about women differ widely from those of the ordinary opponent of enfranchisement and university education. The sentiments conservatives cherish, the writer continues, are those that come in for satire. To understand the poem, one must refuse to examine lines out of context and consider the speaker of many much-quoted passages. A careful reading reveals that, quote, throughout the poem, women's intellect is treated with respect. In fact, the balance of intellect decidedly falls to the women's side, while the men are either below the average of intellect or dismissive of serious study. Typical stereotypes are downplayed in favor of a more important principle. The poet fully realizes that all women are not cast in the same mold, and that it is absurd to set up one ideal for the whole sex. Either's failure is in trying to make a woman in all points like a man. The lesson of the poem is that the true idea is to give her scope to develop her own powers. Yet this ideal, as attractive as it might be, is incomplete. Modern life is infinitely more complex than the view expressed in The Princess. There are many other primary divisions besides that of sex, And examining these divisions, economic, domestic, political, reveals that by custom women have had to take on a larger burden in society. It is natural, then, the writer concludes, that this more complex conception of life should strike a woman rather than a man, and that a woman dealing with the matter should write not calmly as one who pleads for justice for others, but strongly, sometimes bitterly, as one whom a false conception has wounded. Hence, the strident plea for equality expressed in Aurora Leigh is more compelling than that of the outsider's view expressed in The Princess. In her chapter on Victorian poets, on Tennyson and Victorian poets, Amy Sharp, a faculty member at Newnham College, Cambridge, quotes lines celebrating this complementary nature of the sexes and their links as evidence of Tennyson's love of a progressive and ennobled law that urges moderation and progress. Lady Ida's revolt fails through its overstrained absoluteness, Sharp remarks, but the poem anticipates many a modification, actually one since then, and concludes with an idealizing of relations noble enough to satisfy the high-spirited princess herself. In a series of reviews that Linda Hughes has referred to as feminist critiques, the Irish poet Catherine Tynan finds that with few exceptions, Tennyson's women have neither splendor nor passion, all of them too idealized or vapid to represent women accurately. Princess Ida comes closest to being a real woman, Tynan concedes, in that, quote, she is the one who thinks most nobly for herself. No other woman troubles greatly about ideals. They are very much a man's woman in that their only trouble or joy is concerned with love. Tynan concludes that Tennyson's women are feminine as distinguished from womanly. They are clinging, dependent, timorous, loving after a fashion, but not giving to daring greatly for love. Impulsive for possession, but with an impulse which lacks the strength for action or the passion to pursue. Like Tynan, the Irish poet Jane Francesca Lady Wilde, known to many by her pen name Speranza, expressed a generally unfavorable opinion of Tennyson's women. In Notes on Men, Women, and Books, Wilde claims that in Tennyson's poetry one seeks humanity and finds phantoms. Made up of sunbeams and snowdrift, he has given no historical personality to any one of his creations, except in The Princess, where his figures altogether cast more shadow and are more lifelike and less vague, both in personality and spiritual nature. Wilde finds Ida superb, heroic, and beautiful. She believes Tennyson changed his purpose as he wrote the poem. What started out as a playful satire, sharp and fine as fairy lances aimed at women's progress, eventually became a more serious treatment of the issue of equality of the sexes. Wilde believes the prince speaks for Tennyson in arguing for the diverse natures that distinguish men and women, but that Ida holds loftier notions of the force and judgment and reason inherent in her sex. She's almost angry that Tennyson has her submit to the instinct most normally associated with women, love, which blinds her to her noble cause. Love, as it always does, turns her woman's nature to a slave's. Prince emerges as the stronger figure, magnanimous in sketching out a future in which the two, bound by love, can act. After all, Wilde concludes, what woman, genius or not, could resist the tender, subduing sentiment of the prince's wooing? Divine thoughts, divinely uttered. We half forgive Ida that she yielded. What isn't clear to me from this, however, is whether Wilde is being serious or, like her more famous son, writing tongue-in-cheek. Perhaps less well known than Lady Wilde or Tynan, Mary Harman published her brief assessment of Tennyson's attitudes toward women in the 1892 issue of Cornell magazine. Same year, she received her bachelor's degree and began her career as a teacher and research associate to Lightner Whitmer, the founder of the American Psychological Association. Harman's principal purpose in her article, Tennyson and Ruskin on Women, is to challenge their insistence on women's separate and subordinate role in society. Harman says Tennyson presents Ida as heroic, but misguided. She must be led to realize that motherhood is woman's highest vocation. When Ida says to the prince that this mother is your model, we feel the words are true of the creator prince. His ideal of women is not learned save in gracious household ways. The iron moves of the princess seem to be engendered by too much toiling up the stony paths of learning. The message of the princess, Harman says, is that in love and domestic life lies a woman's only happiness. Rebelling against such strictures, Harman asks, is it less noble for a woman to devote herself to the service of her sisters, to elevate them, to free them from intellectual and moral bondage? Certainly, she insists, not all women engage in intellectual pursuits merely to become adjuncts to their husbands' careers. In the introduction to her 1899 edition of The Princess, Elizabeth Wordsworth, the founding principal of Lady Margaret Hall in Oxford, paints a balanced portrait of Tennyson's depiction of women, suggesting that members of his own family influenced Tennyson's high opinion of women's intellectual capacities. Wordsworth praises his portrait of Ida as both intellectually gifted and thoroughly feminine. Ida gets the husband she deserves, one who respects her and whom she can respect. Yet Wordsworth admits there remains a disturbing unanswered question. What of those 600 maidens that Ida abandons to marry the prince? Did they all find satisfactory partners among the prince's followers or elsewhere? If not, what was their ideal life to be? This, of course, is the real practical question at issue in our own day, as it was 50 years ago. Wordsworth believes the poem fails to provide a satisfactory answer. In the early 20th century, the princess appeared on numerous high school reading lists, and a little cottage industry arose to provide guidance for teaching it. Maud Kingsley's manual cautions that from the nature of its subject and the complexity of its treatment, the princess presents more real difficulties for both pupil and teacher than any other of the college requirements in English. Proclaiming Ida's attempts to establish a university aimed at making men's equals is misguided. Kingsley classifies Ida as the exponent of a distorted philosophy, a willful woman crammed with erring pride. Emma Bolemius, however, in her guide, commends the princess for providing a new solution to women's rights and for man's status too. Also writing about the princess in her 1916 collection, Workfellows in Social Progression, Kate Stevens, another pioneer in higher education through her work as professor of Greek at the University of Kansas, gives Tennyson credit for dealing with issues of contemporary importance and landing on the right side of the issue. She writes that the poem expresses conservatively the larger view of women that moved the British mind during the years of its composition, the larger view which was impelling Parliament to enactments granting women greater liberties. It might be helpful, before examining Virginia Woolf's view of Tennyson, to look at remarks by her older contemporary, the renowned classical scholar Jane Ellen Harrison. Harrison was studying at Cambridge during the 1870s and met Tennyson through his daughter-in-law, Eleanor, Lionel's wife. By this time, Tennyson had become a larger-than-life figure, a presence, almost an institution. If he posed a great deal, he was scarcely to blame, Harrison writes. The house was so charged with an atmosphere of hero worship that free breathing was difficult. This was the man that Woolf, born in 1842, would have known as a child, an aging celebrity often given to excessive affectations. Woolf wrote in 1917 that Tennyson was, quote, the supreme example of the Victorian cult of personality, which in those days seemed to have been accorded a license for the expression of itself, for which we moderns can find no parallel in the present day. It's this larger-than-life sage and poseur that she makes fun of in her delightful comic drama, Freshwater. In A Room of One's Own, however, Woolf calls Tennyson one of the greatest poets of the Victorian era. Tennyson is her example of a poor man who at least had the shelter of a separate room in which to write, a privilege denied the woman writer. Yet in the same essay, she quotes Maud as an example of the sentimental poetry that, quote, men hummed at luncheon parties before the war, unquote. Nor did she always agree with Tennyson's sentiments. In The Partagas, she quotes from Locksley Hall to point out that Tennyson believed women were less passionate than men, a view she disputes in numerous essays and novels. Linda Shires has suggested a more direct relationship between the two, one of influence. Because Woolf could find no appropriate female authorities for her work, she turned to Tennyson, in whom she found a gorgeous lyric gift, matched by a relentless, active exploration of the boundaries of consciousness. Her fiction, Shires argues, combines effects learned from Tennyson, the groundswell rhythm of the poetry, the emphasis on hybrid forms of dramatic monologue to monodrama, the deconstruction of sexual identity, and the failure of the subject to be fulfilled by the desired other. Like Tennyson, Woolf is eager to record the flux of experience. Shires believes it would be fruitful to compare Tennyson's supercharging of his words with Woolf's striving for visionary experience, seen most clearly in The Waves, her most experimental novel, which posits 7 distinct sources for itself, eerily like The Princess. Of course, Woolf's feminism has not gone unchallenged, especially in the 1970s, when she was dismissed by one feminist critic as, quote, a humanist, not a feminist, unquote. But her subsequent adoption by feminist critics has made her a kind of bellwether for judging feminist reactions to earlier writers, particularly the Victorians. So her observations on Tennyson should not be taken lightly. And with these remarks, I will conclude today's talk. There is certainly much more to discover and analyze, but I think those tasks had best remain for another day. Thank you.
Please join me